I am a liberal. I believe in freedom. Liberalism means of and belonging to freedom, pertaining to freedom. Those people who now call themselves liberals have misappropriated the term, because for them it simply means that they are liberal with other people's money. But suppose you ask one of those people who styles himself a modern liberal, what do you think about public housing? Do you think that was a good program? Oh, he'll say, that program had some bad features. We had those wonderful houses in St. Louis, the Pruitt-Igoe houses. We had to blow them up. We have, in the course of public housing, torn down more dwelling units than we have put up. In every city and state of the country, public housing units have become a source of crime and indigence. They have done harm. I remember very, very well a personal episode along these lines when quite some years ago, I was in Los Angeles, not long after the Watts riots. And I went down I had a guided tour through the Watts area of Los Angeles. And the man who was guiding me was a wonderful fella who was in charge of a project sponsored by a trade union for self-help for the people in Watts. And I said to him, well, there are some houses over there. They look pretty good, those dwelling units, those apartments. And he said to me, that's the worst thing that ever happened to Watts, he said. Those are public housing. And then he went on. And he said, do you suppose it really helps the youngsters in Watts to segregate all those who are poor in one place? To take all the divided families? Because after all, a large fraction of the poor come from those in which the family is broken up. So you have all the children with only one parent, and their parents all put together in the one building, and they have only one another to work with. That's terrible. We need to have a very different kind of a setup. Well, what he said is right. Wherever it's been used, public housing has been a disaster. But if you ask the proponents of it, people who have been proponents of it in the past, they will agree. But then they will say, but that's because we didn't do it right. We ought to spend more money on it. We ought to have scattered public housing instead of concentrated. Or we ought to have this, that, or the other thing. And over again, you will find that the reaction is, what we've done in the past has not worked, but that's because we haven't done it right. We ought to spend more money on it. I can understand that attitude in the 1930s, the 1940s, when we were starting in this country on the road, and when we had not sufficiently absorbed the experience of other countries. But it is much harder to understand in the 1970s, when we now have 40 years of experience behind us, and we have seen exactly the same thing happen in area after area after area. Doesn't the time come when we have to say, it's not the particular program, it's the system that's wrong? Yes, sir.
I have a question about public housing.
Sure.
I agree with you when you say that the number of dwellings destroyed is greater than the number of dwellings put up. But you are comparing the number of dwellings that are destroyed are 3-story apartment buildings left over from the 19th century. And the dwellings that are put up are about 20 stories high and have about 8 families per floor.
Oh, I mean the number of dwelling units, not the number of buildings. When I spoke, I was not careful, and I should have been. I meant the number of dwelling units, where a dwelling unit is something that houses a family. So in the case of the buildings you're talking about, I wouldn't count that as one 8-story building versus one 3-story building. But the number of dwelling units built is less than the number destroyed. How does that improve the housing?
Maybe you dislike the public housing because of the institutional look to it, and that it looks more like a hotel and looks less homely. But the alternative
that has nothing to do with it.
The alternative is either you have a public house or you have a badly maintained apartment building by an absentee landlord. And
There are no dwelling units in this country that are more badly maintained than public housing dwelling units.
in the South Bronx, people are burning their houses.
Of course, why?
They are
Why?
burning their houses to
Why?
move into public
Of course,
housing.
but why are they burning those houses and abandoning them?
Because
Why?
they're badly maintained.
No, sirree. Because you have rent control in New York City, which makes it uneconomical to maintain the houses and means that the only way in which you can get any money out of them is by burning them down.
Also, an absentee landlord is very...
Absentee landlordism, of course. But you mean to say that the public housing units are not absentee landlords? Look, I am not, you must understand, I think it's important for people to have decent housing. My objection to public housing is that it's made the housing of the poor worse. You've torn down dwellings in which they lived. You've put up, in part, if you take the whole housing program, urban renewal plus public housing, the situation is even worse. You've torn down more dwelling units than you've put up. Of those you put up, a considerable fraction have not been available to the poor. You've torn down low-income dwelling units. Take any urban renewal area in this country you want. You've torn down low-income dwelling units and you've put up luxury apartments. And that's helping the housing of the poor? Not by a long sight. So that the problem is, and then in the public housing units you've set up, because of the income requirements and so on, the people who can qualify for them tend to be broken families. They have an abnormally high rate of juvenile delinquency, of sabotage, of destruction. They are poorly maintained. You see, the problem that this young man is illustrating is the tendency that we often have to take the will for the deed. The problem isn't the objective of the public housing units. The point is to go out and see what's actually happened with them. And there is hardly anybody who has studied the subject who will defend the public housing program as having improved the housing of the poor.